The Saudi-led coalition continued airstrikes in Yemen today, despite announcing on Tuesday that operations would end. Meanwhile, President Barack Obama is taking a tough stance. On MSNBC's Hardball with Chris Matthews, the president said America's warnings to Iran have been, quote, very straightforward.
We've said to them is that if there are weapons delivered to factions within Yemen that could threaten navigation, that's a problem. And we're not sending them obscure messages. We send them very direct messages about it. My hope is generally that we can settle down the situation in Yemen. Part of our goal as the world's leading superpower is to work with partner countries to try to resolve conflicts, to be ruthless in going after terrorism. But we're not going to do that by ourselves, and we're not going to do it just by deploying more Marines in every country that has these problems. We've got to build up their capacity in these areas so that they're not recruiting centers and safe havens for terrorist activity.
Charles Goldberg is an international security policy analyst and a Rise News contributor and joins us to read these tea leaves. Good to see you again so soon, Charles.
Thank you.
Explain to me why the Saudi-led coalition would announce on one day, Tuesday, that they're going to end the airstrikes and the very next day resume attacks.
Well, I think today's action was just a tactical operation against the Houthis, who were trying to overrun a military base in the city of Taiz, which is the third largest city in the country. And the Saudis pushed back against this move. But I think the announcement that the Saudis made was more of an end to the strategic bombing campaign, which they began almost 4 weeks ago. And the strategic bombing campaign targeted infrastructure, weapons depots, things that the Houthis were using to try to conquer and take over Yemen.
So as I understand it, the Houthis were making critical advancements that these resumed attacks address specifically. So going forward, can we see then a decrease in airstrikes from the Saudi-led coalition?
Yeah, I think the airstrikes are, for the most part, over subject to the Houthis not trying to take advantage of that and using that as a cover to continue to take action. So again, the strategic part of this, the bombing of weapons depots, the infrastructure, attacks on infrastructure that the Houthis are using to fight, I believe is what they announce is over. But if the Houthis make any kind of move on the ground, they will still respond to that.
And the bigger picture is, Charles?
I think the bigger picture, we have to take a step back and look at the series of events, how they unfolded, and what that means. And this is really, most importantly, is really one small piece of the larger geopolitical chessboard that's playing out in the region. So in Yemen, Iran is supporting the Houthis. The Houthis are Shia, the Iranians are Shia. These are the proxies that Iran is using in this country. They have proxies in Syria, they have proxies in Iraq, they have proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah in Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. So the Shia are, the Iranians are saying, the Saudi attacks of the last 4 weeks on the strategic bombing campaign was a threat to them, and they sent this flotilla of ships. The United States then stepped in and drew a red line for Iran and said, we're not going to allow these ships to resupply your allies. There's been some mixed messages from the White House about this, but I think that's basically was the purpose. These moves were all telegraphed. The Iranians telegraphed and announced the flotilla. There was no secret attempt to do anything. The United States announced very publicly, leaked to the media, the USS Theodore Roosevelt's deployment, and then the Saudis announced that they were stopping the bombing, and the Houthis announced that they were going to agree to negotiations. So each step was announced, each step was really choreographed in a way that we see now a conclusion to this, at least part of
this phase
of the fight.
And even Iran has said that they would prefer a diplomatic solution here, to go to the diplomatic table. Is that realistic?
I think when you look at Iran, and you have to really understand the culture of Iran, negotiations are part of everyday life. It's what Iranians are very good at, and they will use negotiations when it serves their interests. So currently, because of the Saudi airstrikes, they've forced the Iranian proxies to the negotiating table. So Iran has agreed at this moment, because of the pushback from the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, to negotiate. If in a few weeks from now or in a few months from now that pushback is lifted and they feel it's in their best interest to fight, they'll ask the Houthis, they'll tell the Houthis, let's get back into fighting mode. If there's more pushback at that time, they'll go back to the negotiating table. This is really a difference between a Western way of negotiating and an Eastern or Persian way of negotiating. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about Iranian negotiations, not only here, but also in the nuclear talks.
Meanwhile, I want to mention this before I let you go. While a lot of attention is faced on the conflict between Yemen and the Houthis, in the meantime, Al-Qaeda, AQAP, is making hay with this, as others are concentrating on what's happening with the Houthis. How much of a concern should that be, particularly for the U.S.?
Well, I think the U.S. is most concerned with AQAP, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda in general, because that's the most direct threat to the United States. I think the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Gulf states are more concerned with Iran, because they view Iran as a bigger threat, at least an bigger immediate threat and a bigger strategic threat than ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which I think they look at as mere nuisances. Of course, we were attacked here in the United States directly by these groups. So I think that for the United States, that's the most important area in which military force is needed. And the Obama administration wants to engage Iran and feels that it can moderate Iran with engagement, while the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and the Israelis and Egyptians feel that that's a mistaken approach. And therefore, we have a divergence between the United States and its traditional allies in the region.
We're going to have to leave it right there for now, but thank you so much, Charles Goldberg. Good to see you.
Thank you.